environmental lead at Ground Control, and absolutely passionate about tree planting and looking for all the opportunities we can to plant as a business and as a society. It's really important that we do it now and that we do it right. And I'm thrilled to be joined by Steve Scott, who is the Area Director at the Forestry Commission. Really grateful for Steve to give up his time and be able to share his experience and knowledge with us today on tree planting. Steve is a chartered forester with over 30 years experience in the management of woodland. He studied at the University of North Wales and has worked across England with the Forestry Commission since the early 1980s in roles ranging from port timber inspector, planning the restoration of over 1,100 hectares of woodland blown down in the 1987 storm. He's an advisor to private woodland owners and playing a leading media role in the response to the ash dieback crisis. He's currently Area Director for a patch covering 12 counties, stretching from Essex up to the Peak District. In the early 1980s, Steve took a break from forestry and for 4 years played the drums in an indie rock band called Bleach, recording 4 albums and touring extensively across Europe and North America. Quite a sabbatical. Steve now lives with his wife, artist wife Kathy, in a 16th century Suffolk tour house and has overly ambitious plans for an arts and crafts garden. Steve's team also supported us with the woodland creation project that we did in Billericay. So welcome, Steve, and thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you, Chris. It's a delight to be here, albeit virtually, as it were.
Thank you, and yeah, and thanks to everyone for joining us. The plan for today is Steve's kindly going to set the context and give us some background, and then we'll be sort of embarking on Q&A. So it'd be great if you could submit your questions through the chat function. I'll try and corral those and pass them on to Steve. In terms of this topic, it's very close to our hearts. Ground Control, caring for our environment is our core purpose, and one of our many commitments is to plant 1 million trees over the next 5 years by 2025. So with that, there's a really responsibility to get that right, and hopefully we're going to get some very useful pointers from Steve today on that. So over to you, Steve.
Lovely. Thanks, Chris. I'll just try the inevitable share of screens. Just give me the nod, Chris, when that's up there.
Yep, you're there.
Jolly good. Thank you. So as Chris says, I'm just going to try and set the context just to get the juices going, really. I'm planning to speak for about 15 minutes and giving as much time as we can for chat and discussion, because I think that's the most useful thing. You'll probably know a lot of this, and that's why I'll go through it at pace. But also I've sent Chris a PDF version of this, so if you want a copy, we can arrange that. Please don't circulate it further, because I nicked some of the images off the interweb, as one does. So without further ado, just firstly to say something about who the Forestry Commission is. We are in England only now. A couple of years ago, Scotland left the Forestry Commission family, and Wales did back in 2013. So we're only in England. We're split into 3 bits. Forestry England manage our woodland, Thetford Forest, for example. And they hold all the concerts and so on, and are the most sort of visible face of the Forestry Commission. Forest research, very important aspect to what we offer, and obviously they do all the research in forestry, both for us as an internal customer, but also wider in the industry. And then The other bit that engages with the private sector is internally called Forest Services, but essentially is the bit of the Forestry Commission that you would deal with if you needed a felling license or came to us for a grant or advice. And I work for that bit, the Forest Services bit of the Forestry Commission. Our money and our policy is driven by DEFRA, so we have an arrangement with them, but we're still a separate ministry in technical terms. So that's the Forestry Commission. During the pre-election period last year, tree planting became a very hot property, and there was this kind of rush to outdo each other in terms of manifesto commitments, which you can see on the screen there. It's the first time that I can remember tree planting, woodland creation being so hot up the political agenda. Obviously, we ended up with a Tory government, and they committed in their manifesto to a 30,000 a hectare tree planting figure across the UK by the end of the 5-year period. And I'll give you some context about what that means in a minute. In England, our target or our aspiration is around 10,000 hectares a year by the end of that 5-year period, which, believe you me, is really going to be testing us. To make that happen, they announced in the budget in February, which then got overtaken, of course, by COVID, but they announced in the budget a £640 million commitment to Nature for Climate Fund, the large proportion of which is for tree funding. So as a result, we will see a lot more activity, more funds, and a significant increase in my staffing as well to help you if you are interested in tree planting, which again is a great move. In terms of the sort of wider policy context, these are some of the kind of policy drivers that are driving some of that manifesto commitment. Clean growth, trying to kind of reduce our carbon, and trees obviously suck up a lot of carbon, so they can help with that. There's a 25-year plan for the environment led by DEFRA and other carbon commitments that we've got. And a lot of this is what's driving this big push to get more trees in the ground. We've also got an agricultural bill, which is working its way through Parliament. That's going to change the way that forestry can compete, particularly on agricultural land. As some of the subsidies get withdrawn, then forestry becomes a really viable option particularly on the lower grade agricultural land, and we'll come back to that later. And we've also got a tree strategy that was consulted on during this year and will emerge next year to pull all of these policy aspects together. So all of that is really heading us in one direction, which is to create more woodland of one form or another. So why? What's the point? Well, again, I think you'll be familiar with a lot of this, so I won't dwell over it for a long time. But trees provide a huge list of benefits, and you can make the most of those depending on what your objectives are. Just to go through a couple of those. In terms of the water agenda, they can ameliorate flooding and increase water quality, and also cool rivers, which is of benefit to fish and so on. In the agricultural context, they can provide shelter for stock and for crops. There are agroforestry interests, not only with stock, but also arable interests. And I'll say more about that in terms of the funding environment a bit later on. In the urban context, obviously, they act as air conditioners, both heating and cooling our urban realm for the amenity and for recreation and so on. Fantastic assets. Biomass was a big thing 10 years ago or so, and is still a big contribution to more sustainable forms of heating. And a lot of people are planting and managing woodland for that still. Timber, don't forget that we can use trees to build stuff, and then that ties up all the carbon almost in perpetuity as well. And we're seeing a big push to use more timber in construction and to use more homegrown timber in construction. And climate change, that's the biggie. That's the one that's driving a lot of this push now to get more trees into the ground. Obviously, trees sequester that carbon and hold it for their life. Typical rotation for oak is 180 years. For pine, it might be 60 years. Obviously, you release that carbon if you then burn it, but if you use that timber in some sort of construction or furniture, then you've tied up that carbon. And the carbon markets now are really what's driving a lot of this new interest in woodland. And again, I'll touch on some of the financing at the end. But we don't want to repeat the mistakes that were made post-war. You'll be familiar with the flow country, for example, where trees were planted on moorland, the wrong tree in the wrong place. We're all about the right tree in the right place for the right reason. And to underpin that, we have the UK Forestry Standard, which is the thing that the Forestry Commission will ensure that all tree planting or woodland creation adheres to. We have a regulatory framework that sits underneath that to make sure that we are planting the right tree in the right place for the right reason. So how are we doing? Well, when the Forestry Commission was formed back in 1919, we'd hit an all-time low in terms of UK and England woodland cover. It was down to about 5%. In England, over the last 100 years, we've increased that to about 10%, so we've doubled it, but it's slowed down in the last few years. In terms of the European context, the European average, depending what you include as which bits of Russia you include in Europe, the average is around about 44% woodland cover. And in England, as I say, it's 10%. UK is about 12% because there's more in Scotland, as you might imagine. So arguably, there's still quite a long way to go. And if you look at the net figures, the 15, 16, 16, 17 are the last that I have in terms of net figures. Actually, we went backwards. There was more woodland being removed due to development, mainly in the sort of mid part of this decade than was being planted. And on average in England over the last 10 years, we have planted about 1,200 hectares per year. And the government wants us to get to nearer to 10,000. So you can see it's a massive ask, a sort of 7-fold increase in our activity. So I've just now, Chris was interested in me just kind of covering some of the best practice things about tree planting, how to get it done. Preparation is absolutely key. I would urge if you are interested in tree planting to be thinking years ahead for a number of reasons, and I'll go through some of those. You need to do planning. We can help with that. There's a very good template that we can help fund a woodland creation planning grant to help you through all the steps. You need to do your site assessment. You need to look at the soils. You need to look at the existing ecological interest, look at the archaeology. You need to do all your site assessment. There are grants. Frankly, they are painful to go through, but the money is really good. But you need to give some time in advance for that. There are a number of tools that can help you in planning, and I'll go through some of those. And there's this kind of regulatory hurdle that you have to go over to make sure that the right tree is in the right place. I've picked off one or two of the tools just to show you some of the online stuff that is useful. This particular one is the ecological site assessment tool. You put in your site data, your moisture, your soils. You can make it very bespoke, and then it will give you a list of all the trees that might be suitable, the main timber species anyway, that might be suitable for your site, and how they will fare under various climate change scenarios looking sort of 50 years hence. That's a really powerful tool. Again, these are all in the public domain. You can Google them and find them. They're all freely available. This is a nice one. This is a climate matching toolkit where you can put in your current location, as I did here. I'm up in North Suffolk, and you can look at the various climate change scenarios. And this particular map shows where North Suffolk, where the areas that currently have the similar climate that we are likely to experience in some of the climate change scenarios, and you can try different options there. And that might then drive you in terms of some of your species and provenance choice, because obviously we will be experiencing drier, hotter summers, wetter winters, that kind of thing. So that's quite a useful tool. There's a very good tree species database that Forest Research run. And this is another useful one. This is our map browser. And we've done a sift of all the kind of low sensitivity land. It's taken all the ecologically sensitive sites out. It's taken all the high grade agricultural sites out and gives you a map of low sensitive areas. And this is around where I live. The yellow areas on this map are those that are showing as low sensitive. Now, just a warning on that, just because it's low sensitive doesn't mean that's a carte blanche to do whatever you want to. You still got to go through due process. And just because it isn't low sensitive doesn't mean that you can't plant trees on it, but it does guide the eye and is a useful tool. These are just a few examples of what we've got. We've also got professionals in the Forestry Commission who can help talk you through these issues. There are professional agents and companies like Ground Control out there who can do some of this for you as well. And of course your own skills, and you know, there's nothing like getting a spade out and doing a soil pit to tell you what's on the ground. So use the tools, but they are only tools. So in terms of doing it right, you need to think about your objectives. And I'm talking about woodland creation in the wider sense. That might be tree planting, but it might be a kind of, that top photograph is of NEP. Many of you will be aware of NEP and the kind of the push towards rewilding. If your objective is to let nature express itself, and that and rewilding is good for you, then that's an option. It's not currently easy to get that funded, but that may change. But if you're trying to grow a crop of oak for timber, then rewilding is probably not the way for you to go. So it's horses for courses, using the right kind of methodology, the right sort of silviculture to meet your objectives. Planting stock, if you are going down the planting line, then you need to think well ahead of your plans. Everything's sold out this year. It was sold out even earlier this time last year. It takes at least 3 years to grow trees to plant from seed. And if you want something special or interesting or unusual, then you're going to have to pre-order that with nurseries. You can't just expect to plant something this winter and expect the trees to be there. If you are late, then you might end up with stuff that's planted and grown elsewhere in Europe, and that may have sort of biodiversity risks associated with it. So again, thinking ahead of the game, ordering your stock, working with your local nursery to get what you want when you want it. Site preparation. Generally, the best policy is to do the least amount of site preparation that you can get away with. The less soil disturbance that you do is obviously good for carbon and biodiversity and so on. In lowland England, there are various techniques, including sort of ripping and ploughing, or mole boarding or screefing, or even just kind of doing some sort of mulching. So there are various options there, but again, getting that right and doing it right will help your establishment from the outset. Protection, certainly in this part of the world, wherever you are going to get hit by deer damage unless you protect the trees. For a long time, we've been using plastic tree shelters to aid that. They have their role, but clearly we are very conscious in this day and age about the use of plastics. So if it is possible to use a conventional fence, then I think I would, be steering you towards that. There are cost benefits and disbenefits to think about there, but that must be built in right from the outset. We can help fund that through the grants, but you do need to think through your options there. Weed control, for the first 3 years at least, you must keep a weed-free area around each tree, around a metre diameter, ideally. You can do that through herbicide or mulch mats or mechanical means. But if you want your trees to survive, that's absolutely vital. Beating up is the replacement of lost trees. You can either overstock at the beginning and accept a few losses, or you have to go back each winter for a couple of 3 years and just replace those losses. Again, it's that maintenance, that care. It isn't just about sticking them in the ground and walking away. And then further on, maintenance might be, maintaining those fences, upgrading your roads and so on, and maybe pruning or brushing the trees. It depends on your objectives. But again, it just isn't about walking away once you've planted the trees. And then just finally, what support can the Forestry Commission offer? I'll be asking questions about this slide later, so I hope you're all paying attention. There's a lot of detail there, and I'm not proposing to go into it in any at any length. If you want more information, just come back to me directly or through Chris. We've got a number of grant funds at the moment that we can help fund woodland creation depending on your objectives. Countryside stewardship is mainly for water or biodiversity benefits, but we've also got large-scale carbon funding as well. If you're within 25 miles of the HS2 line, then there's a special fund to help fund woodland creation there. We can offer funding to do the planning at the beginning, and the rules have changed on the threshold of that. It's now only 5 hectare threshold, so that should be of interest to some. If you're interested in planting trees in the urban context, we have a specific fund for that. And then there's a whole heap of new carbon funding, which is making things very interesting to fund that kind of lean gap between the woodland establishment and then getting timber further on. And we can help fund some of the carbon as well by underpinning what the carbon is worth or will be worth in your woodland. So there's a lot of funding out there already available. If you're below our threshold, the Woodland Trust also offer some subsidised tree planting grants as well. And things are going to move in this spring where we will make the grants much more flexible. So if you're interested and our funding fits, then come and have a talk. But please do the right thing for your objectives first, rather than following the funding. Don't necessarily confuse good silviculture with the grants, because they're not always the same. So that was it. I think we're going to move over to questions now. I think I'll stop sharing that. And over to you, Chris.
Yeah, that was great, Steve. Thanks very much for that. Some real insight there, and great to see that there is that support out there from the Forestry Commission, and the sort of long overdue resources are now starting to be made available to help us out. We've got some questions coming through, which we'll jump onto, but just starting off with the right tree, right place, and trees at any price. There have been a couple of recent pieces in the news where well-known woodland charities have made mistakes and planted trees in environmentally sensitive areas. I know this is a big concern of our lead ecologist, Nick, to make sure that we're not just planting trees wherever we can. Over and above the standard, how should we be avoiding that, and what kind of powers of the Commission got to make sure that we don't make similar mistakes?
Yeah, this is really important. There's been some recent coverage of a case up in Cumbria where the Forest Commission ourselves have missed some ecological interest. That was one where that ecological interest wasn't known or wasn't mapped. The area was heavily grazed, and that interest only expressed itself once the creatures had been taken off and the grazing pressure had been reduced, and suddenly things came up that we were previously unaware of. There was another case that I think you're alluding to in the Lake District, which was quite a small area but happened to be a really heavily floristic area. So, you know, there are one or two examples of mistakes that have been made. The vast majority of the things that never get any coverage, of course, have been planted wholly in the right place for the right reasons and have only contributed to biodiversity. So it only takes one of kind of course celeb, and of course the whole thing can potentially be damaged. Anything over 2 hectares in scale has to come past the Forestry Commission to be assessed. So, you know, hopefully we will pick up the majority of those forms of interest. Anything below that, then I think there's a big onus on those doing the planting to make sure that they've, you know, doing the ecological assessment. Generally, if you're working on arable sites, then planting trees is going to be a biodiversity benefit. Even in that context, you need to be concerned about or aware of proximity to triple SIs, for example, for ground nesting birds, where if you were within 500 meters of planting trees, then that might increase the amount of predator perches and so on. So it's not always straightforward, but there are a number of tools to be able to search for ecological sensitive sites. There are specialists out there who can walk the ground and make sure you're doing the right thing. It's all about this kind of work that you do beforehand to do your site assessment to make sure you're doing the right thing.
That's great, thank you. A couple of questions that have come through. What are the best plants or trees for us to plant in our own residential settings, so at a smaller scale, to help address climate issues?
Yeah, this is always a bit difficult to answer that, because it depends. It depends on A, what you're trying to achieve, B, the soil, C, the kind of aspect and the amount of difficulty those trees are going to get to establish. Some trees are tougher than others. Tree size will come into it. You know, the ultimate sort of spread and so of those trees. Some species are more pollution tolerant as well. There is plenty of guidance, there's plenty of literature out there in terms of species choice for urban areas. And there are, you know, again, we can offer some specialist help on that if people want to take that forward. But generally, you're looking probably at deciduous trees rather than evergreens, because they then shed their leaves and the pollutants will go with them. Of course, even there, then you've got kind of leaf drop issues, which in some urban areas might be a problem. Yeah, so it's a complicated, you know, you have to go into that in some detail. So I'd be loath just to give you a list of the top 3 trees for an urban setting.
Okay, thank you. In terms of the larger scale establishment, you know, what should we be looking at for land for tree planting? You know, through the Evergreen Fund, we've been looking this year to carry out tree planting projects, and actually land availability is a real stumbling block for us. So in terms of I guess there's 2 stages to this. Is, you know, what land should we be looking at and where, and also how do we unlock that land where potentially landowners are not too keen on converting from, say, agriculture to forestry? Yeah,
well, as I said, some of the tools that are out there really help in some of that search. So if you use our map browser, the Forestry Commission map browser, and look for the areas of low sensitivity, that will guide the eye. As I say, that's not just a carte blanche there to do what you want, but at least that kind of guides you to the areas that are of lesser sensitivity from the outset. I've lost count of the number of times that owners have come to us and said, well, we bought this land here, and you know, you look at it and it's full of triple SIs and breeding bird assemblages, and you know, you think, well, why did you ever pick this? So certainly use that. If you're looking to buy land, then of course the availability is very limited at the moment, and it may be that a lot of those low sensitive areas simply are not on the market. So then you're working with the existing landowners, and it's a business choice in the main. It may be we often get people who are approaching retirement age and want to have a lower input kind of management regime and are interested in planting trees, but often this is a business decision, and I think a lot of this will out once we lose some of the subsidies for farming. We get into the new regime of elms and so on, and the carbon funding settles down in forestry. We're already seeing a big upsurge in interest from farmers. So if you're looking to buy at the moment, it's difficult because the availability is limited, and then it's just about working with the landowners and helping them make sensible decisions about their land holding. A part of which, or an increasing part of which, is probably now going to be forestry as part of that portfolio.
Okay, great. Quite a broad question, this one, so we might need to sort of focus it in on the sort of southeast. But what are the best species for long-term establishment in the UK, given our changing climate?
Yeah, again, that's difficult because that will depend on the soil type. On the lighter soils, the range of species. So on the sands, the green sands, and so on, the species list is lower. Those on sort of calcareous clays, there's a longer list. But again, it depends on the local soil moisture deficit regime, the hydrology, the aspect, the depth of soils, and lots of other things, all of which you can model. You need to think about what your objectives are from the outset. So if you're looking to plant trees for timber, that's one set of species. If it's for amenity or biodiversity interest, it's another. The role of natural regeneration as part of that mix might be in there. If you've got an area surrounded by ancient woodland, again, you're going to have to think about species that aren't going to knacker the interest, frankly, in that ancient woodland by spreading into it. So, invasive species and so on. Whereas if you're on a completely greenfield site that has no particular ecological constraints, then you might be thinking about more novel species from the Balkans, for example, where a lot of the Ice Age refugia species kind of ended up that we never got back into Britain because of the English Channel. And you might be thinking about provenances from 2 to 5 degrees further south. But as I say, if your interest is driven by expanding an ancient woodland, you probably don't want to go that direction. So again, that's a very complicated question, a complex answer to quite a complicated question. But that's why you employ professionals to help you through that.
Absolutely, and it sounds like we should be engaging with the Forestry Commission resources and mapping to help make those decisions. Some more questions on the chat. So oak framed and oak clad buildings, are they a good thing?
Well, in terms of tying up carbon, any use of timber in construction is fantastic. We've seen an increase in a lot of timber frames going into construction. A lot of that's imported from Canada, frankly, so there's a kind of import issue there. There's certainly in this part of the world, there has been historically a use of cladding on buildings. It's kind of less used than it was. Certainly at home here, we've got a sort of a barn extension, and that's clad with larch. But use of oak cladding, in the right circumstance, would be wonderful. It depends again what your objective is. You can get hold of British oak of a standard that would be useful for cladding reasonably easily through sawmills and suppliers. And if that's what floats your boat, why not?
In terms of the modern building techniques and using softwood in construction, obviously we're building a lot of houses, and I assume probably with the recovery that there'll be focus on house building again. Do you think the sort of carbon storage capacity of that timber in construction is kind of fully understood or fully valued?
I think it is from a technical point of view. Whether the building trade is making full use of that, it's not my area of expertise, but I probably doubt it. I think there is still a preponderance of kind of traditional brick and mortar buildings, rather than using some of the more interesting technologies like the SIP panels, for example, where you're basically using wooden panels which are floated into a wood frame timber. They've got really good performance standards and so on, and they're all made to be fire retardant and so on. So I think the potential there to use wood in construction, is well understood from a technical point of view. It's probably not used as much as it could be by the trade.
Okay. In terms of the impact of trees near water that you mentioned in your presentation, could you expand a little bit on that in terms of the role that they can play in terms of flood prevention?
Yes, again, that's a very subtle answer. So we can help model what sort of woodland should go where on a tributary to a river that floods, and we can map where that needs to be maximized. So essentially, where you would concentrate woodland to help ameliorate flood is further up the catchment, mainly on the small tributaries. Technically, you would put a band of trees at right angles to the water as it flows down. That band doesn't need to be very deep, about 15 meters at minimum, so it doesn't have to be much, but it has to go from one side of the catchment to the other on those tributaries. That then will hold water back in successive stages. If you've got a number of these kind of dams, if you like, of trees, they will hold back because you get a sort of roughness in the undergrowth as well as the trees themselves. They'll hold back successive bits of water, and that's enough then just to reduce the peak flow at the critical point at the critical time. So if there are particular communities at risk of flooding, this can make the difference, that sort of intervention. And they've done it on some of the tributaries. The one at Ripon, for example, up in Yorkshire is a good case, and there's one down on the Perrott in Somerset where they've done some of this. But there's you need to persuade the landowners who own that land where those trees need to go at that critical point in order to absolutely maximize it, and that's a bit difficult in a democracy. So again, we know how to do it, and it can be a really valuable tool along with the kind of hard engineering to sort of reduce some of this peak flow stuff. And it has ecological benefits as well, because you get seasonal pools of water and so on. So it's very exciting. The potential is huge. We just need to landowners to take up those offers more.
And I guess it's quite a challenge for that, because the landowners that are having the most effect aren't getting the benefits, because the impact they're having is improving things further downstream. So it's sort of they're not seeing the benefits directly themselves.
That's right. I think you'll see some of that come, this sort of payments for ecosystem services. You'll see some of that come through the emerging environmental land management scheme, ELMS proposals. But at the moment, there isn't a market for water as there is for carbon. So it's early days yet. Yeah.
Okay. And sort of flipping that on its head in terms of tree planting, are there any situations where actually tree planting could have an adverse effect on flood situations?
it's funny how things have moved. So there was this push sort of 20 years ago to take trees away from streams and so on, because it was felt that when the debris fell into the water, it was actually going to block things and create floods and so on. But in actual fact, I think that the mood has changed, the research has changed on that, and all that kind of backing up of water bodies is a good thing. If you're not, if you plant one of these sort of permeable barriers that I was talking about, but you leave a gap in it, you can actually funnel the water to make it go quicker. So again, you need to engineer that quite carefully so you don't make things worse. But generally, tree planting for flood prevention is a kind of no regret solution, but you just need to get it right.
Okay. How significant do you think the replacement of the EU farming subsidies will be on woodland creation and rewilding? Is that sort of hype, or actually is that going to be a practical solution for us?
No, I think it's huge. Clearly, all the landowners who have been in receipt of the subsidies are going to have to think carefully about how they move forward. And on marginal ground, you know, we've all seen the stats where actually the subsidies are the entirety of the profit that the landowners are making from some of those land holdings. And with the grant offers and the carbon financing and so on, tree planting, woodland creation suddenly becomes a real option. And we've suffered in this industry really from that kind of unlevel playing field for 40 plus years. There will be other options, of course, and there will be really important cultural discussions around what these future landscapes look like. You know, the kind of classic Lake District landscape of sheep grazed pasture. You know, is everybody ready for that to be covered in larch, for example? I don't think so. So I think there will be some very interesting, difficult discussions to be had in some of these landscapes. But I think the uses of woodland on some of these marginal farmed landscapes is going to be a much bigger part of what we do in this country.
Excellent. That sounds very positive. A very technical question here, but what is your favourite tree and why?
Yeah, I should duck that one, I think. When I was a kid in primary school, we were taken on a field study to a place in the Cotswolds called Seven Springs, and there was
Oh dear, we seem to have lost Steve there. Obviously reminiscing on his childhood has frozen the system there. We'll just give him a sec and see if that he comes back. Oh, he's... Hi, Steve, you're back. We lost you there.
Yeah, sorry about that. I was starting to wax lyrical, wasn't I? And suddenly I was gone. Yeah, I was just saying that I am very fond of the Dawn Redwood, Metasequoia glypstroboides. It was rediscovered in China in 1948, having only been previously known from fossil record, I think. So that's my exotic choice. And field maple, if you've got to make me pick one from a native cohort, field maple, I think is a very undervalued tree, which I think could be used more. But it kind of almost depends what day of the week it is to answer that question.
Yeah, no, I'm sure. We're sort of getting to the end of our time now. I'd just like to squeeze in one more question, if that's okay, and that's around the rewilding. It's certainly something that's getting a lot of press and is very much in vogue. I have some reservations about it in terms of potentially, you know, not giving us that resilience to the fast changing climate. Just wanted to sort of get your view on rewilding versus planting.
Well, I think that the whole rewilding movement is very exciting. It's really very now. There's a lot of media interest in it, and where it's done right for the right reasons, it is amazing. But it comes back to what your objectives are. If you're looking for a very extensive land management option where ecology is the main driver and perhaps some sort of very high quality meat production is your thing, you're indifferent about what comes when, and you're completely relaxed on time frames, and you're not interested in timber, and you're not interested in particularly in carbon or the water benefits or whatever, then rewilding might be exactly right for you. But if you are interested in some of those objectives and you have and you're driven to some extent by time, then planting is likely to be part or all of the answer. So I come back to it. If you want to plant a crop of oak trees for timber, then you're unlikely to get that in a hurry from a kind of rewilding situation. Equally, you can, you know, it doesn't have to be one thing or the other. You can do enrichment planting to get the diversity of species and provenance choice that you want to supplement the regeneration that you'll get for free. The other aspect about using natural processes is that they spread it at quite a slow rate. You'll get good regeneration typically on the kind of northwest side of a woodland within, say, 30 meters, but then you're relying on the sort of natural spread and jays and other dispersions to kind of fill up the rest of your field. So it just depends on what the drivers are, but don't rule out either in meeting your objectives, but you just need to be thinking about what you want to create in the first place. Just don't go down with it because it's kind of sexy and fashionable.
Great. Okay. Well, thank you. Yeah. Well, I think we need to sort of wrap things up now. I certainly could carry on for the rest of the day talking about trees. So, but everyone has busy lives and other things to be getting on with. So, just a great thank you to you, Steve, for taking the time out and sharing your experience and knowledge with us today. And yeah, many thanks from myself and all of us for taking the time to speak with us.
Yeah, been an absolute pleasure.
Thank you very much, and thank you to all of you for tuning in and listening. Thanks very much, and bye now.